Hi, my name is Vibu Puvvala, and today I'll be talking about what shapes perceptions and tolerance of naturally occurring events. This project was conducted with Michael Price and Tigran Melkonyan of the Department of Economics here at the University of Alabama. Starting out with some background, utility is an ordinal measure of the benefit derived from a good, and it differs across agents as a function of individual preferences. Ordinal measure simply means that the value assigned to utility doesn't have any meaning except for its magnitude relative to other utility values. So utility of 2 for, say, an apple means nothing other than the fact that an orange having a utility of 1 means that apples are preferred to oranges. And utility is typically a concave function, which means that you need increasing amounts of good to receive the same increase in pleasure from an extra good. And this concavity directly induces risk aversion. And it's good to illustrate this with the example of a coin flip. Most people would prefer a guaranteed $100 over $200 on the flip of heads of a fair coin, as the extra $100 is more than outweighed by the risk in the decision. And so this risk and individual risk preferences alongside risk and ambiguity directly influence decision making. And now you may be asking yourself, well, what is ambiguity? Risk, or classical risk in this case, refers to situations where outcomes are unknown, but probabilities are known or at least able to be estimated in some objective way. And a classic example of this is a coin flip, but also most games at a casino, blackjack, craps, roulette. You may not know what's going to happen, but you can estimate the odds of the outcome that you may or may not want. Ambiguity, however, refers to situations where the probability distribution itself is unknown and is unable to be estimated in an objective way. The Ellsberg urn is a classic example of this, where a urn that has 50 red and 50 blue marbles is a great example of classical risk, where you may not know what's going to happen, but you do know that there's a 50-50 shot of drawing either color of marble. An urn with that you don't know how many red or how many blue marbles are in there, however, you don't know the odds, and that is a more ambiguous situation. And under classical models of decision-making under uncertainty, we can measure an agent's belief through eliciting matching probabilities, which are defined as the probability at which an agent is indifferent between a payoff if an event occurs and a payoff with a fixed probability. Again, going back to a coin flip, most people's matching probability for a coin flip on heads would be 50%, as most people would perceive the odds of that coin flipping heads as 50%, and they'd be indifferent towards a payoff in either case. Ambiguity, however, comes into the picture where you may not know if the coin is fair. You may not know if I'm offering you a weighted coin, and you may place a 20 or 30% or even a 70% chance on the odds of the coin giving the outcome that you may want. And this ambiguity leads to people weighting possible probability distributions by their degree of ambiguity aversion, leading to their decisions. In our experiment, we focus on perceptions of uncertainty and ambiguity on macroeconomic data within the general US population. And macroeconomic data has been all over the news recently, with volatility surrounding tariffs, figures coming out related to inflation, GDP growth, and unemployment. And the reason the perceptions are so important to understand is that they can create a self-fulfilling loop in which expectations about indicators can influence people's decisions regarding spending, shaping indicators like inflation itself. For example, if I'm going holiday shopping and I think that inflation is going to be higher in December, I may increase my spending now, which directly injects more money into the economy, which creates more inflation itself. And so in our project, we tested perceptions of tariffs on China, Canada, and the EU, inflation on housing prices, car prices, and general inflation, as well as macroeconomic indicators like GDP, unemployment, interest rates, alongside some controls. And previous researchers have used the probability matching framework that I talked about earlier to elicit general attitudes towards risk and ambiguity, utilizing both foreign and domestic stock indices. Respondents were asked about an ambiguous option 1, where you would receive a payoff if the outcome occurred, or a risky option 2, where you would receive a payout with a fixed probability. And the respondent had asked about 3 events that together span the entire probability space. All that means is that no matter what happens, the outcome falls into one of the 3 boxes. And these 3 events, we just labeled them A, B, and C for convenience, as well as 3 compounds, which are formed of combinations of the singleton events, AB, AC, and BC. And the difference in probability weights placed upon the singleton events and the compound events allows us to estimate what the ambiguity preferences and perceptions are of the respondent. So we measure these perceptions of ambiguity through the ambiguity aversion index and the insensitivity index, where ambiguity aversion ranges from -1 to 1, and it simply measures how much payoff a decision maker is willing to give up to avoid ambiguity. So looking at using this as an example where you're choosing between the ambiguous option 1 and the risky option 2, how much earlier you switch from the ambiguous to the risky option reflects the amount of ambiguity that you are averse to. How much payoff are you willing to give up earlier to avoid ambiguity? Ambiguity and sensitivity, on the other hand, refers to how much ambiguity you're perceiving and how you're able to distinguish between different levels of ambiguity. So in a situation where you may not know the probability distribution, there's a natural tendency to shift and blur probabilities towards, I don't know what's going to happen, shot in the dark, 50-50, it either happens or it doesn't. And so ambiguity and sensitivity allows us to measure the degree to which respondents are doing that. And together, insensitivity and aversion tell us how the agent first perceives ambiguity and then how it impacts their choice. Looking at how an example of how we did this in our study, in our question regarding Chinese tariffs, we split the probability space into the tariff rate being under 50%, between 50 and 60%, and greater than 60%. And so an example respondent may place a 20% weight on the probability being less than 50%, a 60% probability on it being between 50 and 60, and a 30% weight on it being greater. And the compound weights are listed below. Note that the probabilities don't sum to 100, and that's because subjective probabilities often don't, as you're giving your perception of a single event in a vacuum. Taken together, they don't always add to 100. And so this is a very typical response that you may receive, and doing the math, we find an aversion index of about 0.15, which reflects a slight aversion towards ambiguity, but not anything severe. And we find an insensitivity index about 0.67, which reflects moderate insensitivity towards ambiguity, which suggests that that decision makers are not distinguishing between probability distributions very much. And going to our findings, we broadly find across the board that mild positive ambiguity aversion, suggesting that respondents are averse to ambiguity in situations, but not overly so. What's more interesting is that we find broadly across the board as well that respondents are quite insensitive to ambiguity, and this suggests that they're not perceiving much difference in the tariff rates on Canada versus China, and that they're not able to distinguish too much. They don't have too much clarity on what's going on. So the other interesting finding that we found so far is a high correlation between these ambiguity aversion coefficients. And this high correlation implies the existence of a baseline level of ambiguity aversion, that no matter what the situation is, that you're going to have some degree of ambiguity aversion, and based on what the situation is, you may have even more or even less. And this is able to be differenced out using fixed effects methodologies. We have not done this yet, but we do plan to. And we also find a high rate of violations that is relatively homogeneous across topics. And this applies unobserved heterogeneity, that there are factors in this experiment that are leading to a rate of violations that we'll be able to difference out, again, using a fixed effects model. This semester was primarily spent on experimental design. We received this data just about 3 weeks ago. So over the coming months, we plan to conduct more detailed analysis, like the fixed effects model that I mentioned. And with that, I'd like to open up to any questions.
So how do single and compound events help isolate ambiguity and insensitivity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So single and compound events help us distinguish between help us calculate a participant's aversion and insensitivity towards ambiguity, as combining events together naturally increases ambiguity, as you don't know whether taking A and B as an example, you don't know whether your guess is more on A, more on B, and shifting it together just creates a larger window, which increases variance, increases spread. And in theory, the probability of AB should be equal to the probability of A plus the probability of B. In any rational world, that is the case. But if you're not placing a flat probability on these events, then merging them together is often going to result in a probability that is lower, which allows us to measure ambiguity.
Could you clarify how you distinguish risk from ambiguity?
Yeah, so risk refers to a situation in which you know what the probability distribution is. Again, you don't know the outcome, but you do know the odds of them. And ambiguity refers to situations where you don't know the probability distribution itself. This is the outcome that tends to arise more in real life. You don't know if you're going to lose your job in the next month. You don't know what the return on investment is going to be. You don't know if your kids are going to like the dinner that you cook. And so ambiguity is what arises more in real world situations, and it's pretty important to understand.
Could you go back 2 slides? What do you think are causing the high rate of violations? Like, what's causing this heterogeneity?
Yeah, so there's a lot of potential factors. Some of the main ones the biggest one likely is just that these events are so ambiguous that people don't really have an idea of, well, I don't know what the rate of tariffs is going to be on China. That's just something I've never thought about, and so I'm going to click this 20% number because that just feels safe. And that being applied broadly can lead to a higher rate of violations.
How could this framework be applied to real-life decision-making?
Yeah, so understanding how participants act under ambiguity has been investigated relatively broadly in the past, but doing it in topic-specific environments can help us understand how people around us are reacting to specific volatility. In the past few months, there's been a lot of volatility surrounding tariffs, surrounding macroeconomic indicators, and understanding how we perceive those things specifically and then how they influence our actions can be really important for policymakers to understand as they try to do their jobs.